Good.
Welcome into the Odds and Audibles podcast. I'm Matt Prey, America's Global Jared Mack on the show. Unfortunately for you, the listener, or you, the watcher, you're coming into a conversation we were having before recording, and it got funny. But nonetheless, hey, we got news. We got injury news. We've got preview for Washington for Utah. We've got review of Washington State. Um, and let's start with the injuries. Jared, you had the story up on duckterritory.com. Um, there's guys hurt, but the information is pretty glean.
Yes, sir. Yeah, this is peak Mario Cristobal here, just being vague, and that's all right. That's our injury news. So we'll start with DJ Johnson. DJ Johnson did not dress against Washington State on Saturday. The collective we saw him out at practice on Wednesday, not in any gear, which was a bit telling, but we didn't know until Saturday, and he did not suit up. So that happened. Keith Brown, Mario said that he tweaked something, but it doesn't seem to be major. Keith played a lot of minutes on Saturday in the first half, not so many in the second half. I think we now know why. We don't know exactly why, which is, again, Mario being vague, but happens. Next up to the bat was Johnny Johnson. Johnny Johnson left the game in the second half after a reception. Big catch, big play. He got up and walked off the field on his own power and then headed to the injury tent. And then headed to the cart where he hopped on there and was driven to the locker room. Coach Cristobal said that they're evaluating the situation, but they're hopeful, whatever that means. So we'll go with that. Seven McGee is good to go, according to Cristobal. McGee was hurt in a kickoff return. I saw the play. He just got drilled in his back and probably just, couldn't breathe for a second because that stuff hurts. For Jackson LeDuc, this was an interesting one on Wednesday of last week. Cristobal said that he was questionable for Saturday against Washington State, but had we asked a week later, he would have been good to go. Cristobal, again, talked about that sentiment and said that he is ready to play. Another player was Jackson Powers Johnson, who was ready to play last week, but didn't see the field. He's ready to play as well. And lastly was something about Rob Ashford, who didn't dress, obviously didn't play, but normally he comes dressed up in pads and everything like that. But this time he was on the sidelines in street clothes.
Yeah, he was asked. It was really funny. He was asked if it had to do with what happened at the end of Washington game. And all of us know Robbie Ashford was one of the guys talking some smack to UW. Mario Cristobal was like, I don't even know what you're referencing, and we all know what he was referencing. Like that was a pretty funny moment. But I think we've reached the point where injuries again have become a point in the season where it's everyone's banged up, and if we have guys that are going to be out, or if we have guys that people who think that they're going to be out, we're going to be super coy about it because we don't want the opponent to know who's playing, who's not playing, and that help their game planning. Because it's happening at Utah too. They had a couple players go down against Arizona, and Kyle Whittingham described them as significant injuries after the game, shut down any kind of injury talk that happened at his press conference on Monday. And Nick Ford, Utah's most versatile offensive lineman, was one of those guys who was dealing with injuries. He apparently went on a radio station, 1280 AM in Salt Lake City Monday morning, and was asked about it. And noting, Kyle Whittingham said this was a significant injury. This is what Nick Ford said. I'm all good. I just had a really bad cramp. I have a really bad sinus infection, and I'm on a buttload of medication. Some of that medication will make you dehydrated. On that last drive, when we hit that quarterback sneak, my hamstring started to cramp. Next play, it was my calf. Play after that, it was my stomach. I just had to finish the drive before anything else. A pretty significant injury for Nick Ford was cramps. So, the gamemanship is on. Cristobal is being very secretive of what's happening with injuries on Oregon's side, and Kyle Whittingham is blowing up cramps as a significant injury. It's game on.
Do you think I love it from a gamesmanship perspective because it is kind of provide another kind of look into the side of the program, how they're handling things. Do you think we need to get to a point where there's like some sort of injury report that's required for all these schools? You have it
Sure.
in the NFL.
I'm all for that. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the NFL requires you to designate every day of the week, I think, and then leading into the game to provide one. You don't have any of that in college. What you end up with is, again, I know that's professional. This is college, but what you end up with there is at least an idea of what's going on with players going into a game. At least an idea from an injury report perspective. If you're Oregon or you're Utah and you're fans or you're like us and you're covering the team, and we hear things here and there that we don't report and maybe have a little bit of idea than most, but if you're just casually following this team, I think it's tough to go into each week going like, who's available? And especially when the coaches are intentionally, they are intentionally being coy. They're intentionally being, I don't want to say misleading, but they're certainly not being forthright with everything. And we're at a spot here where, you're going into the biggest game of the regular season since, I guess, not conference, but the biggest conference game of the season, I guess. And there's a bunch of guys with question marks. And after listening to Mario speak, you either think all of them are good or they're not. And that's probably somewhere in between. And reading between it can be kind of challenging. I think overall, from a health perspective, I'm going to knock on wood around my desk. You feel pretty good about the direction from a health perspective about the last month or so. And I knock because you don't want to have another rough weekend. But there was a stretch there from the opener through right around the Arizona game where it felt, I guess, through the Stanford game too. You lost C.J. Verdell and Bennett Williams and that one, and Alex Forsythe. But maybe it was the Stanford one where it just felt like every week it was a really, really key guy, not just lost for a game or two, but for the season in some cases. And we haven't quite as much of that of late. Although Ryan Walk being lost against Washington hurts, Johnny Johnson potentially being lost for a significant period of time against Washington
Steve
State.
Stevens as well. We don't know what's up with
maybe it hasn't slowed down. We've just gotten so used to and accustomed to it. But it does feel like they're healthier or they're in a better trajectory right now than they were for a part of the year where it just felt like every key guy was out of the lineup.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that like with how they handle their injuries, they do the same thing on their depth chart every week. I mean, I write the article every week, and Ryan Walk is still starting as this week's depth chart at left guard. George Moore is still the left tackle, and so is Stephen Jones is still the right tackle. So that's just how Oregon is going to play the long game with this one.
Oh yeah. Long story short, we have a good feel for some guys. Some other guys we just don't, because it's that type of the season now where teams are going to be coy. And it's not just Oregon. It's frustrating. It's everybody. And I'm with Eric. I think we'd like to see some kind of uniform policy be in place where we have a clear idea. And it could be the day of the game, honestly. Hey,
right.
12 hours before kickoff, you need to release your injury report, or 9 hours, something of that nature. Let's move to reviewing of the Washington State game, because we did speak with Mario Cristobal and his coordinators, Joe Moorhead on offense, Tim DeRuyter on defense. And I think we learned quite a bit about the upcoming opponent, but also some thoughts on just the effectiveness of how they played in that game against Washington State. And I think in particular, the second half, adjustments clearly were made. And I think that was probably the biggest difference, was getting some guys into better situations on both sides of the football, which resulted in Oregon being able to pull away from a 14-14 halftime deadlock.
Yeah, I asked Tim DeRuyter about, I thought the pass coverage was just significantly better. You go rewatch the game, I think you'd agree. Obviously, statistically, 199 yards for Jayden de Laura in the first half, about 81 in the second, and I think about 40 of those came on that last drive, which was against second-team defensive players. And one of the things DeRuyter said was he called the better game in the second half. He did a better job he pointed to I think it was kind of a pick route, whatever you want to call it, the rub route that led to the Stribling touchdown. I think that was their first touchdown there, where he just said he had them in the wrong schematic situation. He had them in too much man coverage there, and that was a fault in that particular situation. And he thought he did a bad job in the first half, or a disservice with some of the situations he put his players in. But felt like throughout the game they got a better feel for making those adjustments and putting his players in better position, and that showed in the second half. Again, really, really impressive second half. 2 consecutive weeks here where Oregon defensively has held opposing offenses to just not very much success. To especially, I think, limiting the number of drives that even are dangerous drives or threatening drives. And you think about the Washington game, there really only was the one that they scored on. The Washington State game, they had the one at the end of the game, but that's against second-team defense. And the other one where they scored points was thanks to a very questionable call. And even if you think the call, maybe we'll say the call wasn't questionable, they were put in an adverse position because of the field position that came from that, with that drive starting right at the 50-yard line. Just collectively, the defense it's not just that they're limiting the number of points scored. To me, it's the fact that they are really limiting the number of opportunities the opposing offense has to even score at all. I mean, just most of these drives in these last two games in particular don't get to midfield, don't get close to midfield. They gain 10 to 20 yards at most before they punt. And that has been, I think, you look at the way Oregon has performed offensively, I think that's part of it too, is just the way that this offense has had opportunities because of the way the defense has played to start in plus situations. And because I do think over the course of a game, there's a cumulative effect of facing this offense in this run game where the opposing defense is not given a whole lot of a break to kind of settle in, and get a rest. And this run offense for Oregon has just continued to power through opposing defense and I think wear them down.
Oregon's defense clearly made a second half adjustment in the passing game. They needed to. I was just going through the drives real quick. They had 5 drives of four plays or less. One of them was the first drive of the game where they went 77 yards and then had a fumble at the goal line. But and to Eric's point, they're 80 yards of passing in the second half. 40 of them came on one throw. It was immediately following the Brown fumble. It was a 50-yard line to the 10-yard line. And, they were really impressive all game long. Obviously, going into the game, that was an area where there was a bit of concern. Other than Ohio State, Oregon secondary really hasn't been tested. That maybe there's a reason behind that now, as we can kind of tell that they're a good group. Dante Manning, DJ James, Michael, Triquez, Jamal Hill's been playing really well. Obviously, Verone, the general, he's there. It's a solid group, and they have a lot of depth going forward. At safety is a little less depth, obviously, with Steve Stevens going down and Bennett Williams earlier in the year. But it was imperative that they make second half adjustments, and they did. And this is like a couple weeks in a row now of Oregon's defense making second half adjustments, which honestly, last few years under Mario Cristobal, some of the narrative has been that Oregon doesn't make a lot of adjustments in game or a lot of adjustments at half. And, this season that narrative hasn't really been talked about. I think it's a real plus to Mario and who he's hired as his defensive and offensive coordinators over the years, especially this year. But this team's defense is good at points, and I think the defensive line is really helpful, and it was against Washington State.
Not to pull away from another podcast, but Stuart Mandel for The Athletic was on with Bruce Feldman on Sunday, and he brought up a good point of he feels like Oregon's being penalized, for anything and everything, and that they really can't, I guess, please anyone no matter what they do. And then he came out and said that they're running up the football on everybody. They beat Washington State, who is a really solid team, by 14 points. Their defense is playing lights out. He doesn't understand where the negativity towards Oregon is coming from. He admitted, they have the Stanford loss, but everyone outside of Cincinnati and Georgia have a loss under their belts. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this team is, after watching Washington State live and then reviewing the game again a second time Sunday afternoon, and then hearing the coaches talk today or on Monday, I just feel like this team is starting to trend, even with its injuries, to its best football. I feel like right now defensively, they each and every week can get considerably better, and they're already playing at a high level. And I think that the offense I think what happened from a passing standpoint at Washington, you throw that out. You don't worry about that because the weather and the elements of that game prevented both teams from really throwing the football. You look at Washington State, you look at Colorado, you look at the games before that, and I think this Oregon offense is starting to click too. They're figuring things out. I think if you go back the last 4 or 5 games, I think Anthony Brown has probably thrown 4 or 5 of his best balls of the season over those games. And so I think going into, and this maybe shifting into the Utah part of things now here, I think Oregon's going into this game firing as close to as they can be on all cylinders. Are there things to work on offensively? Sure, there are. But their bread and butter is controlling the clock, being physical, dominating the line of scrimmage, and running the ball down your throats. And they're doing it as good as they've done it all year going into this one.
Utah's going to be a really interesting matchup. These teams both like to run the ball.
Yep.
That's what they like to do, both of them. These are, I think, 2 of the top 4 rush offenses in the conference right now. And both have had huge running games of late. I think, forget the exact stat, but Utah ran for like almost 500 yards or something against Stanford.
Yeah.
And that was a just beleaguered Stanford team. So whatever. Oregon, its last 2 games over 300. The week before that, close to 300, and that was a game where they threw the ball really effectively. That was Anthony's best passing day. So, you figure if that was a little bit more tailored towards the run, they'd probably get 300 against Colorado. Both teams really want to run the football, and I think it really comes down to who wins in the trenches. And statistically, at least right now, that favors Oregon. Oregon is a better rushing defense based on numbers. Games are not played based upon numbers. Both teams have superstar players at what I would describe as the second level, even though KT moves around so much that you can call him pseudo 1.5 level 1.5 or something like that. Or sometimes he's playing defensive line with a hand down. Sometimes he's at outside linebacker. Sometimes, as Jared mentioned, I think it was in last week's podcast, but also to some interview questions to Tim Baruder, also sometimes like a will linebacker, but he's standing there. Utah's similar to that. They have Devin Lloyd, who is the closest thing probably to a Kayvon Thibodeau in terms of most dynamic, most disruptive players in this conference. Statistically, he is superior to Kayvon Thibodeau. Thibodeau missed a ton of games. We've run through that all before. I'm not questioning who's better. I think everybody listening to this podcast agrees. And frankly, most Utah fans probably do too if they're trying to be unbiased. My point is that these teams both want to run the football, and they both have star players that are going to try to get in the way of that happening. And I really think this could come down to which offensive line performs better, which running back performs better, and then which guys in the front 7 perform better. And I would honestly say I think Oregon has the edge at every single part of that, and which is why I feel pretty good about this matchup. Now, it doesn't mean that the game is going to be played exactly to all of these strengths for Oregon. Utah is going to do whatever it can to play at the weaknesses Oregon has on defense, and there are certainly a couple that we're aware of, I think, each week when we watch the games closer. But I really do like this matchup for Oregon. I would feel worse if this was a team that was, and again, I know Cameron Rising's had some pretty darn good moments, hasn't thrown many interceptions, been pretty good careful with protecting the football. He's not, CJ Stroud. He's not a upper echelon passing quarterback, and his offense has some playmakers on the outside there, but they aren't going to beat you the way Ohio State has. So I think ultimately, I feel pretty decent about the way these teams kind of stack up against each other. And again, from a personality perspective, they're so similar that it kind of comes down to which one can kind of follow through with what they want to do the best.
Yeah, Oregon and Utah's offense are, if you look at it from just a very basic perspective, they're almost the same thing.
Yeah.
Cameron Rising and Anthony Brown are like the same player. They're game managers. They don't take shots down the field too often, and they can run the ball. And both teams will want to solidify the run first and foremost, and want to beat you in the trenches and get you tired in the fourth quarter, and then steamroll you as the rest of the way. I think, Eric, you said that whatever team establishes the trenches first is the one that's going to win. I think whatever team has a better quarterback play has a slight upper hand. Mm-hmm. And if it's Anthony Brown in Oregon, I think Oregon has a really big upper hand at that point. Because then you'll have to have, your defensive backs. You can't stack 6 or 7 in the box. You can't really commit to the run, because maybe Anthony Brown will actually, beat you down the field and find Devin Williams or someone like that. For Utah, this game becomes like far more interesting than it probably should be. But if Cameron Rising can start to beat you over the middle and down the sidelines, and start connecting on 15 to 25-yard routes, it does the same thing to Oregon's defense. You can't stack the box. You can't wait for them to run for you, and then you're kind of backtracking the entire game, because then Utah will start to unleash their run attack on you. But this is also assuming that Oregon's defensive line doesn't get pressure. Utah they run a lot of 2 tight end sets, which much appreciated to our good friend James Crepio, the Oregonian, who loves asking about the 12 and 22 personnel guys. But Oregon will need to get a lot of pressure off of that, and they've struggled at points, and they've also struggled to defend tight ends. But Jamal Hill has really been coming into his own as a safety now for Oregon. Obviously missed the first game of the season with his suspension from the team, but we're far past that now, and I think he's playing probably his best football. But that'll be something to keep an eye on as the games progress too. It's just how Oregon can stop Utah's 12 or 22 personnel, what their pressure looks like in passing downs too. I'm not the biggest fan of Utah's offensive line. I think they can be beat around the edges, and that's where Kayvon Thibodeau and Braden Swinson, Mace Funa, people like that, that's where they come into play. But yeah, I mean, it does probably ultimately decide, who wins the trenches is going to figure out who's going to win the game. But I do think that quarterback play for both teams is just so important this weekend. And if you can get an A game out of Brown, if you can get an A game out of Rising, you instantly feel better about your chances of either pulling off the upset or continuing to win.
Can I really quickly, Matt, before we jump to something else? I just want to say I don't know. We just saw Anthony Brown have a really great game running. I think Devin Lloyd will neutralize some of that from an Oregon perspective with his athleticism there on that second level in the middle defensively. I don't expect it's going to be quite as much Anthony Brown.
You might see it something like UCLA, where UCLA's athleticism on the edges and that linebacker kind of not eliminated, but certainly cut down Anthony Brown and his rushing. Obviously, the Oregon offense in general, their rushing yards were probably the lowest that they had in a game this year. But yeah, that Devin Lloyd is going to be a problem, and Oregon absolutely has to account for it the same way Utah has to account for Thibodeau.
Strangely, that was Brown's previous best rushing game with 85 yards, but 40 came on one run. So sorry, Matt. Go ahead.
Right.
I was just going to point out, Eric, you brought up how you feel like Oregon has advantages at every position. I would agree with that. So I'm not pushing back on that at all. And I'm actually going to provide some context to support that. Oregon has the 9th most talented team on paper, according to the college team composite rankings on 24/7 Sports, which accumulates all the recruiting rankings every year and then creates who has the most talented team all the way down to the worst. Utah is 32nd in the country, and they have 17 4-star players on this team. They have 0 5-star players on this team. They are within an earshot of California, who's at 39. They are within an earshot of Stanford and UCLA. UCLA is 24th, Stanford is 25th, and ASU is also 26th, but Oregon hasn't played that team yet this season. I will say, I think Utah is probably the best school in the conference in turning a 2-star or a 3-star player into an all-conference caliber player, into, in often cases, an NFL player. I think you have to acknowledge the fact that they are very good at developing, but developing 3-star players only goes so far, and they only have such a high ceiling. When you recruit 4- and 5-star guys, much like Oregon has done, you have a greater chance of developing even better football players than what Utah has. So on paper, this should be a game in which Oregon, like you said, has the talent advantage. Now, I will point out that Cristobal brought up going into the Washington State game that this was a game against the Cougars that would be physical. They were a veteran team. Utah, I think, is even more. I don't know how they do it, but they always just seem to find ways to every year have just a litter too deep of guys who have played 40 or more career football games. Just a real quick count: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 guys, 11 guys, 12 guys. 12 guys on this
You
team.
sure there's not 13?
Have
No?
played. It's 12. Have played 40 or more games in their career. They have a guy that's played 54 games in his career. It's wild how Utah figures out how to do this. So I think outside of Ohio State, this will be, and this may be even more than that. This will probably be the game where physicality, the team that's the most physical and the one that can handle the other one the easiest or the best, wins, because they are older players, they are developed players, and they play, like Eric has said, a very similar style to what Oregon likes to do. And Jared's point about quarterbacks, that's 100% spot on. I think this is a game where Anthony Brown needs to be able to – he doesn't have to throw for 300, but he needs to be able to pick and pop and get some connections downfield with his passing game.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, you're right, and that's fair too. Because what can't happen is this is only running all the time. You can do that against a team like Washington that's really just not effective against the run. And I know statistically, again, Utah's a little down from previous years. They still stacked up pretty well most weeks against some of the better rushing offenses in the conference. And I mean, they're not vintage 2019 Utah, which is funny to talk about a vintage or like some sort of legendary team from 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Yeah.
That was a fantastic Utah defense that literally nobody was running against with any level of effectiveness. And I remember going into that game, that was part of the reason we kind of wrote off Oregon's chances of winning. We were just kind of like, well, they're not going to be able to run the ball. And if Oregon can't run the football, who are they really going to beat? And yet they go out and have so much success. So, the ability for Oregon to establish the running game is critical, but how much effectiveness they can have there will be in somewhat, I think, related to the ability to throw the football and what Anthony Brown can do outside of the pocket. His ability to kind of put pressure for Utah so they can't sit. And I think one of the things that was interesting that Mario talked about was just how structurally and schematically this is a team that has been very close to identical for every year he's been in the conference. Going in against Utah what they're going to do. They're not going to they don't mix things up too much. They're kind of are what they are. And what you want to do against Utah is maybe force them to have to get a little creative because Oregon is so nuanced and so multiple offensively. And that's a challenge for Oregon, right? I mean, we know this team can run the ball. We have not consistently seen this team be able to throw the ball. And we've seen it better of late. But if Anthony Brown has a game, and again, this is going to be a tough atmosphere for him to play in. And so far, he's had a harder time away from home than at home. I think anybody can recognize that looking at the splits. If he has a tough outing against Utah and he's not able to make the throws he needs to, or he ends up checking it down all the time, or he turns it over because he's trying to do too much, that could flip this game. If Oregon's able to be consistent and get an early lead, kind of like what they did against Washington State, I know they kind of gave some of that away, or Washington State caught back up, but if they can do that, I just don't know if I see Utah as a team where if Oregon gets up 28-14, 28-10, if I really see Utah as a team that's capable of coming back. Because like Oregon, they're not really built to do that. They like to play with the lead.
So sorry. Yeah, I just had a few more things. I think we've seen this year when Anthony Brown needs to be a pocket passing quarterback, he has done it. He did it at Ohio State, and at UCLA. And this is a game where he has to be one of those pocket passers. And this, I don't know, maybe it's just like, I guess recency bias after that 2019 performance in the Pac-12 championship game. But while Utah plays a physical game, and they always have big guys at the offensive line and defensive line, look, Oregon manhandled them in the trenches. Wasn't even close. And that was a freshman, Kayvon Thibodeau, who had 2 sacks, a bunch of quarterback hurries. That was a team that I think whose defensive line isn't as talented as they are now. I've said this before. I said this in Monday's Mailbag podcast. I'm not overly impressed with Utah's offensive line. I have been impressed with Oregon's defensive line. This physical approach that both teams take, I think that Oregon is the more physical team. They've manhandled everybody on with their offensive line this year, and without Thibodeau for a bunch of weeks, their defensive line wasn't looking great, and they barely got any real pressure. But ever since, they've played a lot of teams who have changed basically their entire offensive philosophy to make sure that Kayvon Thibodeau is not in the backfield. Can Utah do that? Can they go away from a big running game and just trying to and move into using screens with their tight ends, moving screens with their running backs, or are they going to continue to be a rather pro style offense and give Thibodeau 3 seconds to get to the quarterback? Because Utah's left tackle, watch out.
Good point. I mean, would we take 2021 defensive line at Oregon over 2019 Oregon defensive line?
Yes.
Yeah, 100 times, yeah.
And the 2019 defensive line, like Jared said, was the difference in that Pac-12 championship game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that Utah could not do anything. They couldn't run the football. They couldn't throw the football. And so if we believe that Oregon's defensive line is even better, then yeah, it's probably in a position where Oregon could maybe, I don't want to say like they should, they maybe could, but could they dominate? Like, I don't know. As we've talked this one out, obviously our Friday preview will come out later on in the week, and I've got more time to think about it. But just us three talking on Monday, us three talking today on the podcast, and then just our internal debates that we've had off podcast, I'm kind of leaning towards Oregon might come out and smack them. I don't know.
Yeah, the funny part is we do these podcasts. Here's the roller coaster of the week: is we start the week typically coming off a win, at least feeling pretty good. It was different after they'd lost to Stanford and they came off the bye and even had a tough game against Cal where we didn't have as much confidence. But last couple of weeks they played so well on Saturday that we usually start the week pretty optimistic. And then the middle of the week when we talk to the expert from the opposing school, like we will with Steve Bartle of Ute Zone tomorrow, my confidence, I don't say it goes down, but I start going, oh, okay, here's some points or some things about Utah that I didn't know that now I need to worry about. And then by the end of the week, my confidence, I don't want to say goes back up, but then I kind of revisit some of the stuff that I like so much about Oregon. So I think I feel pretty darn confident right now about these matchups. Because shoot, you talk about the defensive line being better for Oregon from 19 or this year as opposed to 19. The other part they dominated in that 2019 matchup was Oregon's offensive line against Utah's defensive line. Utah's defensive line is not as good as it was then.
Not nearly.
And Oregon's offensive line, I would say you can argue at least, does not have the Penei Sewell superstar at the left tackle. Doesn't have a couple of the interior guys with quite as much experience, but statistically at least they've been performing at a level you can at least suggest they're even with. And so, like, if you think that really comes down to line play, I think Oregon has gotten better since 19
yes.
on offense and defensive line, and you can argue Utah's probably gotten a step lower, which is part of the reason why, like Matt, I do feel like when we talk about this, the more I feel better about things. That doesn't mean that after talking to Steve and he runs through all this incredible data on Wednesday's show that we're not going to be kind of like, we'll see.
Right.
So real quick, Eric, your point about the offensive line.
Mm-hmm.
2019, Oregon ran the ball 510 times. They played in 14 games. They averaged 4.8 yards per carry, and they ran for 26 touchdowns. The 2021 team, they have carried the ball 410 times in 10 games. They averaged 5.5 yards per carry, and they ran for 31 scores. Now, obviously, who quarterbacked 2019? Justin Herbert. Who's quarterbacking Oregon in this season is Anthony Brown. Everyone would acknowledge that Anthony Brown is probably the better running quarterback, and Justin Herbert is significantly better as a thrower. But that being said, statistically, this year's offensive line is putting up better numbers for Oregon's running backs, same guys, C.J. Verdell and Travis Dye, than the 2019 version did.
The only other element there that's important is the offensive coordinator system change here, where it is Joe Moorhead as opposed to Marcus Arroyo. It's also, you mentioned the running quarterback thing. I agree. Anthony Brown's a better runner than Justin Herbert. I hope most listening don't try to push back on that one too much. I know Justin has shown some of that, showed it in the Rose Bowl, obviously. The other part of that, though, was Oregon just straight up didn't run its quarterback. And so there were some opportunities there maybe to have some more success running. But I mean, I think the point remains. Like, I think the more we get through this season and with stacking these really impressive showings on top of each other from an offensive line perspective, get to the point where you go, okay, you kind of see that this is something special. And you just think about this group could almost in its entirety come back next year. George Moore is the only one who has to go pro and has to finish his college eligibility. You could have the rest of these guys come back and then in 2022 just be even more dangerous. Because, I mean, not to slight George too much, but he's the most veteran guy, but he's probably the least talented, or at least one of the guys you point to most weeks and go like, was he the weakest performer from this group?
They definitely don't have the Penei Sewell top 10 NFL draft pick on this team, but I think without a doubt, this unit is significantly deeper than 2019. I will not push back on that at all. I probably personally would lean to the 2019 team because that team did have
a bunch of NFL guys.
Yeah, four guys that are in the NFL. Can we say that about Oregon's 2021 team? I think Forsyth will. I think TJ Bass will. I think Sala and Jones are questionable. Ryan Walk probably won't because of size issues, but talent-wise.
I'm not counting out Ryan Walk having some sort of NFL career just because I've counted him out at every stage so far, and he's proved me wrong. So I wouldn't be surprised. But I'm with you. He's physically lacks some of what you need.
Well, we'll have a Wednesday show that will recap the playoff rankings that come out later today. We'll also do some picks later on in the week and preview this game even more on Friday. Thursday, look out for Steve Bartle of Ute Zone, who, I'll be honest, I hope he can talk me down a little bit of the confidence in this team because as we've talked this out, like I said, I'm leaning towards a win for Oregon and one in which they'll look really good at. Not saying blowout, but I'm leaning in a positive manner, which I was not expecting on a Tuesday morning here. So keep your eyes out for those podcasts that come out later this week. Until then, you've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.